At 85 years old, she feared the nursing home. Her only option was to flee to a reserve, the only place where she wouldn't be found. Eleanor May Whitfield, 85 years old, stood at her kitchen window at 6:14 in the morning and heard her son say her name like it was a problem to be solved. She hadn't meant to hear it. She'd been awake since 4, as she always was now since Raymond died, and she'd come downstairs for chamomile tea and to watch the Blue Jays fight over the cedar feeder Raymond had built in 1997. The window above the sink was cracked open 2 inches. The September air in Asheville was still warm that early, just barely, the kind of warm that apologizes for what's coming. Bradley's voice floated up from the back porch below. She recognized his tone before she understood a single word. It was the tone he used in conference calls, smooth and decisive and impersonal, the tone that meant a decision had already been made, and this was merely its execution. "Once she's placed," he was saying, "we handle the estate cleanly. The house alone is listed at $680. That's before the accounts." Placed. The word sat in her chest like a stone. She didn't move. She stood there with the kettle in her hand, and the steam rising, and the Blue Jays arguing, and her son deciding her life on the back porch of the home she had lived in for 41 years. What Bradley didn't know, what none of them knew because Raymond had been careful in ways his children never thought to credit him for, was that the decision had already been made, not by them, not that morning, and not in any attorney's office. It had been made in 1989 in a notary's office in Weaverville, North Carolina, by a man who loved his wife more quietly than she sometimes recognized, and the proof was a small iron key on a plain ring that Eleanor had kept in the back of her jewelry drawer for 34 years, without ever once asking what it opened. She set the kettle down very carefully, without a sound. She went upstairs. She packed one suitcase. And then Eleanor May Whitfield, 85 years old, walked out of her front door, got into her 2009 Buick LeSabre, and drove away from the life her children were already dividing between themselves. She didn't say goodbye to anything. She filled the bird feeder one last time, and then she left. If you've ever been told, directly or by someone's silence, that you had become too much to manage, that your needs had outpaced your usefulness, that the people you loved most had begun doing the arithmetic and found you on the wrong side of it, then you already know what Eleanor felt in that car. You don't need me to explain it. You've felt it. Maybe this morning. Maybe for years. This is her story. Stay with me until the end, because what Eleanor found in that valley is the reason I'm telling it. Subscribe to Dreams Don't Age, and let's begin. Welcome. Eleanor May Pickett was born on March 4, 1939, in a white clapboard house on the outskirts of Morganton, North Carolina, the second of 4 children of a tobacco farmer and a woman who sewed quilts for the church. Her mother quilted the way other women breathed, automatically, continuously, without ever seeming to begin or stop. Eleanor learned to stitch at 8. By 12, she was designing her own patterns. By 16, she was selling them after Sunday services to women who held them up to the light and said things like, "Lorene, where does this child get it from?" But it was watercolor that owned her heart. She'd found it by accident in the spring of 1953, when her school received a donation of art supplies from a church in Charlotte, paper, pencils, and 12 sets of watercolor paints in small tin boxes. The art teacher, a thin woman named Mrs. Aldred, who wore the same brown cardigan every day of every year, set them on the table and told the class to paint whatever they saw out the window. Eleanor saw the hills. She saw the way the light moved across them in the late afternoon, not all at once, but in stages, like a hand slowly pulling a curtain. She painted that. Mrs. Aldred stood behind her for a long time, without saying a word. Then quietly she said, "You see it differently than the rest of them, Eleanor." She went to Appalachian State on a partial scholarship, studying art education. She intended to teach. She met Raymond Whitfield at a church potluck in the fall of 1961. He was 26, newly hired at a paper mill in Asheville, broad-shouldered and precise in the way he spoke, a man who chose his words as if he were spending savings he'd built over years. They married in June of 1962. Eleanor was 23 years old, and she thought she had all the time in the world. She taught art at Claxton Elementary for 11 years, from 1963 to 1974. She was beloved. There are people in Western North Carolina today, in their 60s now, who still remember Mrs. Whitfield's class. The way she would set a glass of water and a single flower on the table and say, "Don't paint what you know is there, paint what you actually see." She organized the spring shows. She applied for grants. She stayed late on Fridays to help students who needed it, and she bought supplies with her own salary when the school budget ran out, which it always did, every February without fail, and she never once mentioned it to anyone. Bradley was born in 1966, Meredith in 1970. Two more children came after, a boy named Andrew who died of SIDS at 4 months in the winter of 1973, a loss that carved something permanent in Eleanor that she carried without complaint, and a daughter named Christine who grew up healthy and kind and eventually moved to Portland, Oregon, and had nothing to do with what happened later. In 1974, Raymond was promoted to plant supervisor. The new hours were brutal. He left at 5:30 in the morning and rarely came home before 7 in the evening. Eleanor left her teaching position to be home with the children, a decision that felt temporary and became permanent the way so many temporary decisions do. She told herself she didn't miss the classroom. Most days she believed it. She painted when she could. Saturday mornings mostly, while the children were occupied with cartoons or each other. She had a corner of the basement she'd set up with a tilted board, her supplies in a wooden box, and a lamp angled just right, and she would go down there after breakfast on those mornings and paint for 2 hours and feel, for those 2 hours, entirely like herself. Raymond never said anything condescending about it. He framed 3 of her pieces, the Asheville Hills in late afternoon light, and hung them in the hallway without being asked. That was his way. Small, deliberate, permanent. The children were less considerate. As they grew older, Bradley and Meredith developed toward their mother's painting the particular condescension of people who have never made anything with their hands. Bradley, who became a financial planner in Charlotte with a good suit and a practiced handshake, called it her hobby, with an inflection that meant something closer to distraction. Once, in 1998, he stood in the doorway of the basement and said, "Mum, you know you could just buy prints, right? It would look basically the same." Eleanor said nothing. She kept working. She had spent decades learning when to say nothing. Meredith performed admiration better, which was almost worse. She would hold a painting at arm's length and say things like, "This is just so sweet, Mom," in the voice reserved for children's drawings, and set it down and move on to whatever she actually wanted to talk about. Raymond understood without quite having the vocabulary for it. He would come downstairs sometimes and sit in the old armchair in the corner of the basement and watch her work. He never offered technical comments. He never suggested improvements. He just sat there reading or doing nothing, present in the particular way that meant he understood something was happening that mattered to her. That was enough. For 20 years, that was enough. Raymond was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in November of 2012. He was 77 years old. The progression was slow at first, a tremor in the right hand, a stiffness in the mornings that eased by midday. And then it wasn't slow at all. By 2016, he needed help with buttons and stairs. By 2019, he needed constant assistance with the ordinary mechanics of living. Eleanor gave all of it. She converted the downstairs guest room into a bedroom. She learned medication schedules and fall risk protocols and how to help a large, dignified man accept help with the things that had always been his own. She did it without complaint, and more than that, without withdrawal. She stayed genuinely present with him through every stage of it, not performing duty, but actually there, the way you are with someone whose life is the architecture of your own. She stopped painting in the winter of 2020. She didn't make a decision to stop. She simply ran out of hours, and then ran out of energy. And then the supplies sat in the basement, and she no longer went down there because she didn't want to want something she couldn't have. Raymond died on February 17, 2023, at home, with Eleanor's hand in his. She was 84 years old. They had been married for 61 years. In the 14 months that followed his death, she grieved the way people grieve when the person they've lost was also the structure of their daily life. Quietly, incompletely, one ordinary moment at a time. She kept the bird feeder filled. She went to church on Sundays. She answered the phone when her children called, which was less often than she had expected but more often than before, and the calls had a different quality than they used to. Efficient, checking in, a box being managed. She noticed in those 14 months that Bradley and Meredith had begun to treat her differently. Not cruelly, not at first, with management. Phrases entered their conversations. As you get older. Just to be safe. We've been thinking. She understood what the phrases were for the way you understand a fog is turning to rain before you feel the first drops. She was 85 years old. Her mind was completely intact. She walked with a cane on uneven ground and her hips were slower than they'd been. In June, she'd tripped on the edge of the kitchen rug and caught herself on the counter, bruising her palm and her dignity. She'd told Meredith about it on the phone that evening, because she'd thought it was the kind of thing daughters needed to know. She understood, much later, that telling Meredith about the fall had been the beginning of the end. Bradley had a contact in an elder care placement firm in Charlotte, a firm that, as Eleanor would eventually learn, paid referral fees to social workers in the Asheville area. One of those social workers was a woman named Janet Pryor, 44 years old, with a framed certificate from the North Carolina Department of Health on her office wall and a practiced expression of compassionate neutrality that had taken years to perfect. Janet Pryor visited Eleanor twice in August under the pretext of a free wellness check offered through a program Eleanor had never enrolled in. She asked measured questions about the kitchen fall. She asked about Raymond. She asked whether Eleanor had considered community living options, and when Eleanor said no, she wrote something in her folder and thanked her for her time. The papers Bradley brought on the morning of September 6, 2023, cited the kitchen fall, Eleanor's age, and a written recommendation from a licensed social worker. The meeting happened at the kitchen table. That detail would stay with her the longest. Not the legal language, not the folded papers, but the fact that it happened at the kitchen table Raymond had refinished by hand in 1991. The same table where she had fed 4 children every morning for 20 years. The table she had wiped clean 10,000 times. Bradley had brought an attorney, a man named Russell Holt, with small rectangular glasses and a briefcase that was too new. Janet Pryor sat to one side with a manila folder, her pen ready. Meredith had made coffee, which Eleanor found almost unbearable in its presumption. Meredith had made coffee in Eleanor's kitchen, in Eleanor's house, as though the house were already transitioning into something Eleanor was no longer quite the owner of. Russell Holt explained the petition. The language was careful and clinical. Phrases like diminished capacity assessment and temporary protective placement moved through the kitchen air like objects being placed on a surface. Eleanor listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. "We can arrange the evaluation at Mission Hospital," Janet Pryor said, speaking to Bradley in the third person, as if Eleanor were already elsewhere. "There are excellent memory care communities within 20 minutes. Biltmore Park has openings currently. I don't have memory problems, Eleanor said. The room adjusted. Mom, Bradley said, and his voice was the conference call voice now, the smooth one. This isn't about memory. It's about safety. You're 85 years old. You're alone in a 4,000-square-foot house. I've been alone in this house for 14 months, and we've been worried the entire time. Meredith placed a hand on Eleanor's forearm and kept it there, warm and steady and constructed. What if the fall had been different? What if you'd broken your hip? You could have been on that floor for days, Mum. I could also win the lottery, Eleanor said, but I don't make financial decisions on the basis of remote possibilities. Bradley pressed his mouth together. He was not a man who enjoyed being answered. The house is too much, he said, and something shifted in his tone. The management dropped for a moment, something more transactional surfacing beneath it. The upkeep alone, the property taxes on Montford are $11,000 a year. There's a better use for... He stopped himself. The kitchen went silent. Eleanor understood the sentence he had not finished. There is a better use for what this house is worth. $680,000 listed, plus the $400,000 in accounts Raymond had built over 40 years. She understood all of it in that moment, as clearly as she had ever understood anything. This had not been a worry that grew until it required action. This had been a plan. I'd like you to leave, she said. Mom, I'd like you to leave now, all three of you. We have legal grounds to... Russell Holt began. You have a petition, Eleanor said, which I have not signed, which I will not sign. I am 85 years old and entirely in command of my own mind. This is still my house. I'd like you to leave. Meredith's eyes filled with tears, real ones, or a very precise approximation. We love you, Mom. We are trying to protect you. I know, Eleanor said. I know you believe that. She stood. Slowly, the hips were not what they had been, but without assistance. She walked to the front door and opened it. The September morning came in warm and blue. Bradley gathered the papers without looking at her. Meredith touched Eleanor's shoulder as she passed and said something in a lowered voice that Eleanor heard perfectly. She's not going to make this easy. Then they were gone. Russell Holt's sedan backed out first, then Bradley's Infiniti, then Meredith's Camry. Eleanor closed the door. She stood in the hallway with her hand still on the knob, and she looked at Raymond's 3 framed watercolors on the wall. The hills, the light moving across them in stages. She had painted those in 1978. She walked to the kitchen. She sat in the chair Bradley had been sitting in. And then she let it come. The thing she'd held together while they were present. The thing you hold together when you know falling apart will be used as evidence against you. It was not graceful. Grief at 85 is not graceful. She pressed both hands flat against her face, and she cried in the way that people cry when they are alone, and do not need to manage what they look like. Not sobs, but something more continuous and foundational, a sound that came from very deep inside and did not really resolve but simply ran its course. She cried for Raymond, who was not there. She cried for the kitchen table where it had happened. She cried for Meredith's hand on her arm, which had felt almost real, and for the particular devastating loneliness of knowing the difference between a performance of love and the actual thing. Then she stopped. She washed her face at the sink. She looked at the bird feeder through the window. She went upstairs and got the iron key from the back of her jewelry drawer, small, plain, on a plain ring. She sat on the edge of the bed and turned it over in her hand. Raymond had pressed it into her palm in 1989 and said, "Keep this, Elle, don't ask me why yet." She had kept it for 34 years and never asked. She had thought of it as one of his quieter quirks. Sitting now on the edge of their bed, in a house her children had already priced out, she thought it might be something else entirely. She picked up her phone and searched the name of Raymond's late sister, Vera. Then she searched the address he had mentioned once years ago, a property near Spruce Pine in Mitchell County that Vera had bought in the 1960s and lived in until her death in 2003. Eleanor had visited once, perhaps 20 years ago, on a Sunday afternoon. A stone cottage on a gravel road, a porch that faced east. After 20 minutes of property records, she found it. 714 Redbud Hollow Road, Mitchell County. Held in a trust. The trust's listed contact was Raymond George Whitfield. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she got up and started packing. She had 4 days. That was her estimate before Bradley engaged Russell Holt to advance the petition to a formal capacity evaluation, which would require a court date, which would require her presence unless she had already put herself somewhere they couldn't easily reach. She knew this because she had spent an afternoon on her phone reading conservatorship law in North Carolina, which was not the afternoon she had planned for herself. But there it was. She called her own attorney, a man named George Ashby she'd worked with for 30 years, who had written Raymond's will and set up the trust, and who picked up on the second ring. She explained what had happened. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Eleanor, are you safe?" She said yes. He said, "Give me until tomorrow morning." He called back at 7:15 the next day. What he told her took 11 minutes. The trust Raymond had established in 1989 was irrevocable. Eleanor was the sole beneficiary for the duration of her life. It included the property at 714 Redbud Hollow Road in its entirety, the stone cottage, its outbuildings, and 3.2 acres of wooded hillside in Mitchell County. It also, and here George Ashby's voice carried something she recognized as deep professional satisfaction, included the house on Montford Avenue in Asheville. That house could not be sold, transferred, or otherwise encumbered without Eleanor's direct and uncoerced authorization. "Raymond set this up the year after Vera died," George said. "He wanted to make certain you were protected. I don't believe your children are aware of the trust's full structure." "No," Eleanor said. "I don't believe they are either." She lived in the house for 3 more days as if nothing had changed, which required a discipline she had not known she possessed. Bradley called twice, and she answered both times calmly and said she was thinking things over. Meredith came by on the second day with a casserole and sat at the kitchen table and said, in a confiding voice, "Bradley thinks this could happen by the end of the month. I told him we needed to give you more time. So I'm on your side, Mum." Eleanor ate a forkful of the casserole. "Thank you, Meredith," she said. On the 3rd evening, she went down to the basement for the first time in months. The watercolor supplies were exactly where she had left them, the tubes in a wooden box, the brushes in a mason jar, the paper in a flat portfolio. She opened a tube of ultramarine blue. It was stiff, but not completely dry. She squeezed a small amount onto a palette, added water with a brush, made a single mark on the back of an envelope. The color bloomed across the paper, the way water moves through dry ground. She sat with that mark for a long time. On the 4th day, she loaded the car. 1 rolling suitcase, a canvas bag with her Bible, her reading glasses, and her blood pressure medication, the watercolor kit in a paper grocery bag, Raymond's road atlas from the glove compartment, the iron key. She took the 3 framed watercolors off the hallway wall and wrapped them in dish towels and laid them flat in the trunk. She stood in the hallway and looked at the pale rectangles on the paint where they had hung for 40 years. She filled the bird feeder one last time. She left Meredith's casserole dish on the front porch with a note that said only, "Meredith, thank you." She texted Christine in Portland, "Going to see a property of Dad's. We'll be in touch." "Love you," Christine replied immediately. "What property? Are you okay?" Eleanor turned her phone off after that. She would explain later. She would explain everything later. She left Asheville at 7:40 on the morning of September 8, 2023. The city was still summer green. that saturated almost excessive green of the southern Appalachians in the weeks before anything changes. She drove north on 19 West, then east, then north again on roads that had no numbers, only names. The asphalt narrowed. The trees drew closer on both sides. The air through the cracked window changed, thinner, cooler, carrying the smell of creek water and dry stone and something darker underneath, the smell of the mountain itself beginning to prepare for autumn. 40 years of her life had been reduced to one suitcase, one grocery bag, a road atlas, and a small iron key. But she was driving. That was the thing. At 85 years old, she was the one driving. The GPS lost signal 40 minutes past the county line. She had tried it for the last stretch, and it had recalculated twice, routed her down a gravel road, displayed a spinning circle for 3 minutes, and then quietly announced it was unable to determine her current location. She found this more peaceful than alarming. She had the atlas. She had the printed Mitchell County property records. She had a note card she'd found in Raymond's desk drawer while looking for paper clips, his handwriting careful and even. 714 Redbud Hollow Ard Iron Key, second lock, side door. L. You'll know what to do. She had read it 5 times in 4 days. The road became 2-lane state highway to county road to gravel lane, to something that was technically still a road, but had clearly not received maintenance since approximately 2004. The gravel gave way to packed dirt. The maple trees arched overhead, still green but with the first color coming at the tips, a rust here, a pale yellow there, the way a fire begins at the farthest edges. The Buick moved at 11 miles an hour and complained about it in the way old cars complain, not breaking down, just registering its opinion. She came around a long bend and stopped. She sat in the car with the engine idling for 3 full minutes before she looked. Then she looked. The cottage was fieldstone, rough cut, the kind quarried from the mountain itself, set back from the road by 40 feet of overgrown yard. 1 story, a porch running the full width of the front, a chimney at the east end. The porch roof had partially collapsed on the left side, and the boards beneath it had rotted through. 3 of the front window panes were cracked. Virginia creeper, brilliant red already in early September, weeks ahead of everything else, had climbed the entire east wall and was working steadily up the chimney. The yard was waist-deep in goldenrod and blackberry cane, but the walls were solid. She could see that without getting out of the car. The stone itself was sound, no visible cracking, no lean, no suggestion that the structure was doing anything other than waiting. The chimney was intact. The porch posts were standing. The roof, from what she could see, appeared whole. She got out. The air was different here than in Asheville. Thinner, cooler, holding the smell of the creek a quarter-mile back and the goldenrod in the yard, and underneath everything else, the dry warmth of stone that has held the sun all day and is slowly giving it back. Crickets. A woodpecker somewhere in the hemlock stand. The last light of afternoon coming through the maple canopy at an angle that turned everything amber and bronze. She stood at the edge of the yard and she breathed. She found the side door around the east corner. Half hidden behind a curtain of Virginia creeper, she pulled aside with her hand. 2 locks, as Raymond had written. The upper deadbolt was unlocked. The door had been unsecured for years, perhaps. The lower lock was small and iron, older than the rest of the hardware. She put the key in. It turned. She pushed the door open. The smell inside was old stone and dry wood, and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. Not rot, not mildew, something gentler. The light through the east window was golden and thick with floating dust. She could see a stone fireplace, a wooden floor, a chair with a broken leg pushed against one wall, a kitchen through an open doorway, stairs rising to a loft overhead. "All right, Raymond," she said aloud. "All right." She brought her suitcase in. She set it by the fireplace. Footsteps on the gravel outside. A knock on the open door, patient and unhurried. "Ma'am?" a man's voice, careful and even. "Saw the car. Didn't mean to startle you. Name's Walter Gaines. I live about a half-mile up the hollow. I've been keeping an eye on this place going on 20 years now." Walter Gaines was 68 years old, widowed 4 years, with large hands that had spent 4 decades doing carpentry, and a way of standing in a doorway that communicated without words that he would not come inside until he was invited. He had white hair and a face that had been outdoors in all weather for a long time, and brown eyes that assessed, and then, apparently finding what they were looking for, settled into something quieter. "You're Raymond's wife," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Eleanor said. "Was?" He nodded slowly. "He called me once. Must have been 2015. Said his wife might come here someday, and that if she did, she'd probably need a hand. I told him I'd watch the place." He paused. "I've been watching it." She looked at him for a moment. "He never told me," she said. "No," Walter said. "He seemed like a man who handled things quietly." She invited him in. He looked at the collapsed section of porch roof and said he could fix it in a weekend if she had a lumber budget, which she did. She'd stopped at an ATM in Burnsville and withdrawn $400, which was not enough and would have to be a start. He pressed his boot against one of the kitchen floorboards and said the subfloor beneath it was solid. He looked at the loft stairs and said they needed new treads, but the stringers were sound. "These old stone houses," he said, almost to himself, "they don't fall down. They just look like they might." He left at 7 that evening. He came back the next morning at 7:30 with a pickup truck and 2x4s. The first 2 weeks were physical, in a way Eleanor had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. She was 85, and 85 is 85. There is no rhetoric that changes what it feels like to haul rotted porch boards in 72-degree heat, or to scrub 60 years of accumulated grime from kitchen tile on your hands and knees, or to sleep on a camping cot bought at the hardware store in Spruce Pine, because the loft stairs weren't yet trustworthy, and she wasn't ready to risk them in the dark. But she did it. Not gracefully, not without pain. Her hands, which had been soft hands, a woman's hands, developed cracks at the knuckles in the dry air that she rubbed with petroleum jelly each evening. Her lower back lodged formal complaints by 5 o'clock. She took ibuprofen with breakfast and tried not to take it with dinner, and sometimes succeeded. She tracked everything in a small spiral notebook: expenses, tasks completed, materials needed. $847 in the first 2 months, between food and hardware, and the camping cot and 2 tubes of wood glue and a box of 2-inch screws, and a handsaw she bought when she realized she needed one. Walter came 3 days a week. He did not condescend to her. He fixed the porch roof as promised in 2 weekends, while she handed him boards and held things steady and swept up. He repaired the loft stairs, new treads, properly braced, and showed her how to clean the chimney with a long-handled brush, which she did herself one October morning, and emerged from the fireplace covered in soot. He looked at her and laughed. A full laugh, warm and unheld. It was the first full laugh she'd heard in months. "You're actually doing it," he said one morning in early October, standing on the newly repaired porch and looking out at the section of yard she'd been clearing with a machete borrowed from the outbuilding. "When I heard someone was coming, I thought—" He stopped. "You thought I'd be gone by now," Eleanor said. "I thought it might be hard," he said carefully. "It is hard." "Yes," he said, "but you're still here." She learned things. She learned that Virginia creeper comes off stone more easily than it looks if you start at the top and work downward. She learned that a broken chair leg can be repaired with wood glue and a clamp and patience, which are 3 things she had. She learned that the county library in Spruce Pine had reliable Wi-Fi and that YouTube would teach you almost anything if you were willing to watch the same video 4 times. She learned that the man who ran the hardware store on Main Street in Spruce Pine, Earl Owen, 63, greybeard, and a UNC baseball cap, would give her a 20% neighbor discount on anything she bought, and that arguing with him about it was pointless because he would simply charge her less regardless. Her Social Security payment of $1,340 arrived on the 3rd of October. She had $1,890 left in the savings account she'd accessed before leaving Asheville. She kept the spending notebook carefully and knew on any given morning exactly what she had and what she could spend. She began painting in the 4th week. It started without intention. She'd unpacked the watercolor kit and set it on the kitchen table, not to use yet, just to have it visible. The way you leave a book on the nightstand, knowing you'll get to it. One evening in late September, after Walter had gone and the light was doing what it did through the east window at that hour, a thick amber that seemed to hold still for exactly the amount of time it needed to, she sat down at the table and squeezed out a little yellow ochre and some raw umber and began. She painted the view through the east window, the hillside, the maples beginning to turn, the hemlock line at the ridge. She painted it not from memory, not from what she knew to be there, but from what she actually saw at that specific moment, the way the light was moving in stages, like a hand slowly pulling a curtain. She worked for 2 hours without noticing the time. She stood up with her back aching and her hands stained and looked at what she'd made. It wasn't perfect. Her hand was less steady than it had been at 40. The proportions in the lower left were slightly off. But the light was there. Exactly. The way it moved across that ridge in stages. She set it on the windowsill to dry and went to bed. In the morning, Walter came, and she showed it to him. He stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, which she had learned was his way of being serious about something. "My wife painted," he said finally. "She was good. She wasn't like this." After that, she painted every day, an hour, 2 hours, whatever the light and energy would give her. She painted the porch at dawn, the mist still in the lower hollow. She painted the goldenrod she hadn't yet cleared, still standing thick in the south corner of the yard. She painted the stone fireplace, the interior of it from close-up, the way the smoke black on the back wall gave way to the warm gray of clean stone. She painted Walter's hands on a piece of wood, his actual hands while he worked, on a morning when the light was right, and she showed it to him, and he looked at it for a long time and didn't say anything about it, but he also didn't give it back. By the end of October, she had 19 paintings. Some nights the house made sounds she couldn't always account for. Beams settling in the cold, the wind in the chimney, something moving through the dry leaves along the creek. Some nights she lay on the cot and calculated. Her savings would sustain this for approximately 11 months, if nothing large went wrong. Some nights the grief for Raymond was straightforward, just his absence, just the specific weight of missing a person. Other nights it was the other grief, the one for the image of her children she had carried for 60 years, and which she now had to set down and leave somewhere behind her, the way you leave something too heavy on the side of the road. But the mornings came. The light came through the east window. She would make coffee on the 2-burner propane stove and carry it to the kitchen table and look at whatever she'd painted the day before, and she would think, "This is mine. Not the house in Asheville with its 4,000 square feet and its $11,000 tax bill. Not the life assembled around everyone else's needs for 6 decades. This, 19 paintings drying on every available surface, stone walls, a repaired porch, a yellow kitchen table she'd found in the outbuilding, sanded and painted herself on a Tuesday morning because it needed to be done. This was hers. One evening in late October, Walter brought a thermos of coffee and they sat on the repaired porch and watched the last of the color go off the maples, the way it goes all at once when the light changes, like a held breath finally released. He said carefully, "There's a woman in Spruce Pine I know. Name's Carol Reeves. She runs a small gallery out of her house. Community space, not commercial. Does a show every November. He paused. I told her about your paintings. She'd like to see them. Walter, Eleanor said. She's not going to pity you, he said. That's not what I mean. She looked at the ridge, stripped bare now, the hemlocks still dark green and unmoved by any of it. All right, she said. Carol Reeves was 71 and had the kind of directness that comes from decades of not having time for its opposite. She arrived on a Wednesday with sensible shoes and a notepad and walked through the cottage room by room looking at Eleanor's paintings without saying a word. Eleanor followed at a slight distance and did not speak because she understood that this kind of looking required silence. Carol stopped longest in front of 3 of them, the hillside light through the east window, the goldenrod in the south corner, and the painting of Walter's hands on wood. How long have you been painting? Carol asked. Since I was 14. Seriously, most of my adult life. I stopped for about 18 years. I started again last month. Carol looked at her. You stopped for 18 years and came back to this. More or less. Carol made a note. I want to show 6 of these in November. Opening's the 14th. I can't offer a percentage. It's not that kind of show. But I do sell. And I have a contact in Asheville. She glanced up. A woman named May Holloway. She runs Mountain Made Gallery on Lexington Avenue. She has a particular interest in work with what I'd call a lived quality. She would want to see these. Eleanor looked at the 6 paintings Carol had set against the wall and said nothing for a moment. All right, she said. Carol's November show brought 43 people to the gallery space in her house on a cold Friday evening. Not large by city standards, but significant for a mountain road in Mitchell County in November, after the leaves are down and the roads have that hollow sound they get in the cold. Eleanor drove in from the hollow. She wore her good grey wool coat, the one Raymond had always liked. 4 paintings sold that night. Not only the 6 Carol had exhibited, people came and wanted others, ones leaning against the work table Carol had set up. The goldenrod painting went for $1,850. The portrait dawn for $2,400. A small study of the creek in October, done almost entirely in greys and one strong blue, for $1,200. And the painting of Walter's hands went to a woman from Charlotte, who stopped in front of it for 10 minutes, without moving, and then said simply, yes, for $3,600. Total that evening, $9,050. Eleanor sat in her car in Carol's driveway after everyone had gone and looked at the numbers on Carol's check and the cash envelope, and she laughed. Not the polished social laugh, not the kind of laughter that performs feeling. She laughed the way you laugh when something has moved so far outside what you had braced yourself for that no other response is available. Then she drove home in the dark, carefully, on the road to Redbud Hollow. May Holloway called in December. She came to the cottage in January in 4 inches of fresh snow, driving a Subaru that handled the road considerably better than Eleanor's Buick. She spent 2 hours looking at paintings and asking questions about Eleanor's history and process, and then she sat at the yellow kitchen table with coffee and said, I want to offer you a show. March, 8 to 10 pieces, 40% to the gallery, 60 to you. My price range for work of this quality is between $4,500 and $12,000 per piece. Eleanor was quiet. I'm 85 years old, she said. I know, May said. I looked you up. I think the story is there. Not because of your age, but because of the work. It looks like someone who has been waiting a very long time to say something very specific. Outside, January snow was coming down on the stone walls, and the repaired porch, and the hemlock trees on the ridge and the yard Eleanor had cleared with her own hands. It was January 11th, 2024. Eleanor May Whitfield said yes. They came in March, 2 weeks before the Asheville show opened. She heard Bradley's Infiniti and Meredith's Camry on the gravel road before she saw them, the sound of vehicles built for different surfaces, picking their way over stones with something close to reluctance. She was at the kitchen table finishing a large painting, 22 by 30 inches, the Winter Ridge entirely in blues and greys, with one horizontal line of pale gold, where the dawn had broken through the cloud cover 3 weeks earlier. She set her brush down. She wiped her hands. She put the kettle on. They knocked. She opened the door. Bradley was in an expensive wool coat. Meredith was behind him, a scarf, eyes reddened by the cold or by construction. Russell Holt was with them, apparently still retained, his face recalibrating several assumptions as he took in the stone cottage, the repaired porch, the cleared yard, the small stack of painted canvases visible through the window. "Come in," Eleanor said. "The kettle's on." They came in. They looked at the 11 paintings on the walls without comment. Bradley looked at the space, the fireplace, the refinished floor, the yellow table, the loft stairs, and Eleanor could see him calculating. "We've been worried," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "You disappeared, Mum. You turned your phone off." "I turned it back on in October," she said. "You have my number." A silence. "The house in Asheville," Bradley said. "We need to talk about the estate. There are decisions that need to—" "George Ashby has written to Russell Holt," Eleanor said. "I assume you've received that letter." Russell Holt from the corner of the room confirmed that they had. "Then you understand the trust structure," Eleanor said. "You understand that the house on Montford Avenue cannot be sold, transferred, or otherwise touched without my authorization, and that I have no current intention of authorizing anything." She poured the tea. She set 3 cups on the table. Her voice remained the same register throughout, conversational, unhurried. "You understand that this property is also held in trust for the remainder of my life. Mum, we weren't trying to—" Meredith began. "Meredith," Eleanor said, not unkindly, "I'm going to ask you not to finish that sentence." The kitchen held its silence. Bradley set down his cup. "You cannot live out here alone. You're 85 years old." "I can," Eleanor said. "And I am." She looked at both of them steadily, without anger, without performance, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent months getting very good at seeing exactly what's in front of her. "I know what you were afraid of losing. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I want you to understand something. When you sat at my kitchen table with those papers, when you had a social worker declare me a safety risk and an estate problem, you freed me. I spent 60 years being what other people needed me to be. It turns out that I am very good at this instead." She gestured at the paintings on the walls. She did not explain them. She didn't need to. "The show opens March 26th, she said. "Mountain Maid Gallery, Lexington Avenue. You're welcome to come." She stood. "Be careful on the gravel going out. The ground's softer now that it's thawing." They left. She did not watch them go. She went back to the kitchen table, picked up her brush and looked at the Winter Ridge, the blues and greys, the single line of pale gold that wasn't quite right yet. She made one small adjustment to it. Then it was. What happened to Bradley and Meredith in the months that followed was not dramatic. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. The inheritance they had built a lifestyle against, the Charlotte house Bradley had mortgaged twice, against future assets, the renovation Meredith had commissioned against what's coming to us, turned out to have nothing to collect on. The trust was airtight. George Ashby had made certain of that in 1989, the year Raymond had come to his office and said simply, "I want to make sure Eleanor is safe no matter what happens." The house on Montford Avenue remained Eleanor's for the duration of her life. The accounts remained hers. Janet Pryor's conduct was reported to the North Carolina Department of Health by Eleanor's attorney, and a review was opened. Bradley's financial practice, which had taken on debt he'd been certain he could manage once the estate transferred, did not recover easily. The numbers they had been counting on were not coming. That was the whole of it. Greed does its damage quietly too. In the end, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow arithmetic of having built against something that was never yours. The March show sold 7 pieces. Total for the evening, $61,400. May Holloway shook Eleanor's hand at the end and said she'd like to discuss a second show in September. Eleanor said she'd think about it, which was true. She did think about it, on the drive back to Redbud Hollow with Walter in the passenger seat, who had polished his boots for the occasion and said approximately 40 words the entire evening and meant each one of them. The cottage was repaired now, not restored to something it had never been, but returned to what it had always been, solid, warm, small, sufficient. There was a real bed in the loft, a wood stove she knew how to operate properly, a cleared yard where she was planning a garden for spring, herbs, tomatoes, what she remembered her mother growing in Morganton. There were 19 paintings, still her own, stacked carefully in the studio room she'd cleaned out for the purpose. She had Walter, who came 3 days a week and stayed for dinner on 2 of them. She had Carol, who stopped by with whatever was coming out of her cold-frame garden. She had George Ashby, who called once a month to report that the trust was intact and that her children had retained new counsel and were discovering, at some expense, that Raymond had been legally thorough in ways that could not be argued around. She had the east window and the ridge and the light that moved across it every morning, reliable and indifferent and beautiful. One evening in late March, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the last light come off the hill and thought about what Raymond had written on that note card. "You'll know what to do." She had thought, for 34 years, that this was faith in her competence. She understood now that it was something more specific than that. It was a door he had left open. The deliberate act of a man who loved his wife enough to plan for a future he wouldn't be alive to see, who had sat in a notary's office in 1989 and thought, "She may need somewhere to go. Let me make sure it's there. Dreams don't age. That's what I want you to hold on to if you take nothing else from this story." The light that moved across those Appalachian hills when Eleanor was 14 years old and pressed a brush to paper for the first time, that same light is moving right now, across whatever window you're near, whatever hill you're looking at, whatever you haven't started yet because you told yourself the moment had passed. It hasn't. It never does. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Dreams Don't Age. Every story here is about people who were told they were finished and what they built from that moment forward. We'll see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and inspiration. All characters, events, and locations are fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. AI-generated images and videos were used to illustrate and dramatize the narrative.